So a couple quick lectures to go over some topics in SQLite database stuff for Android. First, to review what we did before this. We're looking at a database system that's from this Busy Coders Guide to SQL in the chapter, and it introduces a planetary database. And last time we talked about the main activity and the database helper that was connected or created a database, and then on our main activity we would connect up to our database here. So to review, let's look back at our database helper. This creates our database and executes the SQL command to create the database. So if we go into our database helper, it has to inherit from the SQLite open helper. And this is for opening up databases and setting things up. And the main thing this defines is an SQL string for creating our table, our planet table. So here's written out just in plain text form: create table planets. The ID is an integer, it's a primary key outer increment. The title is a text, and the value is a real number. And then we have an onCreate and an onUpgrade methods. These are called automatically when Android needs to create the database or upgrade the database. Currently, the upgrade method just drops the existing table and then calls the onCreate. The onCreate method executes this query to create the table for us. We need to use a database to do that, and we're given the database as part of this. With this call. So it uses the database parameters, and then this command executes any SQL command in a string that follows. And so we store this as a string constant up above, so it makes it easier to modify. We also add some data to the planetary database. This is done here. It's done using a begin and end transaction. This is covered in the textbook. Let me bring that up. So in the chapter in the textbook on SQL databases, there's a section way towards the end about transactions and setting up transactions. So it's about setting transaction bounds, and talks a little bit about this idea of a transaction being a series of operations that you want to do together, and embedding those. So this is the generic way of setting up a transaction, and talks a little bit more about that. And although this doesn't all needs to be in a transaction, these are all actually independent. This is just illustrates the use of a transaction to group a set of SQL or in database commands over and over again. Now, one thing we didn't get to is we started to find some constants, string constants for the database name, the name of the table, and then the name of the fields in here. We want to, and these are all static methods, and we want to be able to use those in our thing. So one place we should be using those is when we create these strings. So like here we say create table planets. This planet is the name of our table. So rather than having it here, we want to be delete that. And use the table name constant there. So we want to stick that in there. Likewise, for these other areas, I'm going to bring this down to a new line. I'm going to do before the plus. In here, the ID field, the title field, and the real value field, we want to replace those all with these. So let me just do that quickly. So now I've expanded this text field that was just one static text string and inserted the string constants we have up here. So I have things like the next field here is the field name, the planet name field, and then that's a text field and then comma, and then the next one is the gravity field name, and then that's a real. So it gets a little more complicated, but now we've used up all of our constants in this string format, and we should do that everywhere in our table. So like here, when we're executing this drop statement, we say drop table if it exists, and then we have the name of the table there. We should be using that constant here. So we should make sure we're using those constants everywhere. Now within this area, we can just refer to the constants directly, and they're static constants. So outside this, we can just say database helper dot and then the constant name. So we can refer to these anywhere in our project by just saying database helper dot, and they're static fields, so we can get at them easily. Okay, so that's our database helper, and again, we use that simply to create the database and upgrade it as needed, but it doesn't let us write or read from the database or anything. It just creates the database. So initially we had that logic in the main activity, where it generally doesn't belong, but that's what we had. So we created a database helper, called it DB helper, and then from the database helper, we can get a database. So we could declare an SQL database and use the DB helper to get that database. And once we have that database, we can query the database and get a cursor and go through and do different things with the database here. Now this is all in our main activity Java file, but this is really more on the graphical and the presentation end. If we talk about a model view presenter or model view controller, the database stuff is really the database model stuff. And again, the view is the XML file generally, and then this controller or presenter should interface back and forth. But generally, all the database logic should not be in this main activity. It should be in a separate file. So one way of doing this is pretty common, is to stick in a data access object or a data source. These come from old .NET and Microsoft terminologies. They're out the DAO or in data source. That terminology is just been carried through. So often we'll define our own data access object or data source that will be used by the main activity, and then use the database helper to get to the database. And then it will then use the database directly once it has used this to create it. And then we also generally refer to a data object. So if we're storing a bunch of databases here, planets, we'll want an object that represents one planet. So usually we have some object that represents a row or an item in our database, so that when we can read a record from the database, we can create an object related to that. Now there are ways in Java that do this automatically. One of the most common ways is called Hibernate. Let me jump back to our textbook. And at the end of this chapter, they talk a little bit about Hibernate. What about Hibernate? And Hibernate is a really common object relational mapper is what it's called. It'll take relational database records and map them on objects automatically. But this is a pretty heavyweight system, and it's not supported by SQLite, and it's not supported by Android because it requires a lot of stuff. So there are some Android versions of these that you can use that do this automatically for you. But we're going to do it just manually because we're doing a relatively simple process. And it's nice to see what's involved in that. Okay, so we're going to create these two objects and look at those. Let's look at this object first because this is a simple one. So in our database, we created a database. Let's go back to our database helper here. With three fields, an ID field, a title field, and a value field for the gravity. So we're going to create a new object called planets to store those fields. So it's going to have an ID field, a name field, and a gravity field. ID fields are always long integers. The database always returns them of that type. The name of the planet's a string, and the gravity in this case is a float. We kind of have to map the SQL versions of these. So SQL, the ID is an integer which converts to a long. The planet name is a text field which converts to a string, and the gravity is a real SQL field which converts into a float. So we define those, and then we just have our normal functions here, and I've actually just auto-generated all of these. We have a constructor with those three values. We have get ID, get gravity, set gravity, get name and set name, and then we have a toString method. So just a generic class to hold that, and we often call this the data model. This is the objects that we're storing to the database or reading from the database. Okay, next we're going to look at the DAO object and setting up the kind of CRUD methods: create, read, update, and delete. So that'll be in the next video.